The question nobody in Colfax County thought to ask was simple. How does a woman with 23 cents survive the worst winter in territorial memory? The answer had been waiting beneath the earth for 10,000 years, patient as limestone constant, as the pressure that forced hot water upward through fractured rock toward a surface that had no idea it was coming. But Wren Calloway didn't know any of that on October 15, 1886. She knew the weight of a canvas sack against her hip. She knew the particular silence of a wagon driving away without looking back. She knew the sound of snow falling on a wooden sidewalk in a town that had already filed her under someone else's problem. 3 weeks before this morning, her father had been alive. Neil Calloway had built the farmhouse outside Cimarron. With timber, he hauled himself from the Sangre de Cristo slopes in the spring of 1861, before the county had a proper mill, before the territory had decided what it wanted to be. He was a methodical man who believed that the quality of a thing could be measured by how long it held together under pressure. He built his fences with extra posts. He set his foundations 18 inches deeper than the county standard. He taught his daughter to read surveying charts before she could properly spell surveying, on the theory that a person who understood how land was measured would never be entirely without resource. He died on September 24, 1886, with his lungs finally surrendered after 3 years of slow defeat, and he left behind a farm, a mortgage, a second wife, a wooden box containing specific items he had arranged carefully, and a daughter who had spent the previous 14 months doing the work of 2 men while watching him diminish. Mabel Durst had come into the Calloway household in the winter of 1884, when it became clear that the medical bills were going to require a solution that farming alone couldn't provide. She was 51 years old, a widow from the Mora Valley, whose first husband had left her modest savings and a precise understanding of what property was worth. She had looked at the Calloway farm with the evaluative eye of someone who has learned to distinguish between what a thing appears to be and what it actually represents on a ledger. She had agreed to marry Neil Calloway in February of 1884. She had paid his doctor through 1884 and 1885 and into 1886. She had, in the final months of his illness, been present in the farmhouse in the specific way of someone who is waiting for an outcome rather than participating in a life. The will was read on October 13th in the front room of the farmhouse. The lawyer was a man named Tanner Briggs, thin in the way of men who consider their own leanness a form of discipline, with a habit of reading legal documents in a flat, uninflected voice that stripped the words of every weight except their technical meaning. Everything to the wife. The farm, the livestock, the equipment, the land registered under the Calloway name. All of it transferred in its entirety to Mabel Durst Calloway as specified. Wren stood by the window during the reading. A crow landed on the fence post outside and then flew away, and she watched it go, and she thought about how her father had signed this document 9 months before he died and had chosen not to tell her. She had one more day in the house. Mabel delivered the news that same evening, standing in the kitchen doorway with her gray hair pinned back so tightly it altered the geography of her face. The farm is mine now. Your father's will was clear. Everything to his wife. You are not his wife. You are not my blood. Her voice carried the cadence of someone reading from a prepared statement. I've arranged for Dolph Crane to drive you to town tomorrow morning. After that, you are not my concern. Wren looked at her across the kitchen. The stove was burning. The smell of the house was familiar in the way that only the place you grew up can be familiar, not just with your mind, but with your body, your skin, the particular calibration of your lungs. She felt the argument rise in her throat, and then she felt it dissolve. Not because she was wrong. She was not wrong. This was the house she had been born, and the floor she had learned to walk on, the window through which she had first watched snowfall as a child young enough to find it miraculous. She was not wrong about any of that. But Mabel's face had the settled quality of a decision that had already moved past the stage where argument could reach it. I'll be ready at dawn, Wren said. She spent that night packing what she could carry. The canvas sack was large enough to hold her clothes, a skinning knife, a hand auger, a coil of rope, and a tin cup. She took the quilt her grandmother had sewn from the remnants of 3 dresses belonging to women who were all dead-stitched in a pattern that didn't repeat itself once in its entire length. She took the wooden box. Inside the box was her mother's wedding ring wrapped in flannel, a lock of her father's hair tied with a piece of red thread, and a folded paper she hadn't examined in years sitting at the bottom beneath everything else. its presence so familiar she had stopped registering it. She put the box in the sack without opening the paper. She pulled the drawstring tight. 23 cents. Saved across the summer from selling eggs that Mabel now owned by legal inheritance. She turned the coins over in her palm in the last light from the oil lamp. Enough for 2 meals at the lunch counter. Not enough for a room, not enough for stage passage. Not enough in the practical language of the frontier to do much of anything except delay the point at which 23 cents became zero. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. Dolph Crane arrived before full light. He was a heavy-set man who contracted himself out for jobs that required physical presence without personal involvement. He loaded her canvas sack into his wagon bed with the efficiency of someone completing a task he had been paid to complete and had no other opinion about. He drove the 12 miles into Cimarron without speaking once. He stopped in front of a building whose sign read Callaway's General Store, a name that had nothing to do with her family, just the coincidence of a common surname, in a county where common surnames accumulated, and he lifted her sack down to the wooden sidewalk and climbed back to his seat and moved his horse into the street without turning his head. Wren stood on the sidewalk and the snow came down around her. It was the tentative snow of early October, the kind that had not yet committed to accumulation, drifting in the thin pale curtains between the storefronts. The temperature was in the low 30s and dropping. She could feel it in her face, the particular tightening of cold air against skin that announces itself before the mind is caught up. She stood there and looked at the town with the systematic attention of someone who is conducting an inventory under pressure. The boarding house across the street, Mrs. Holt, 50 cents a night, 27 cents beyond her means. The church at the end of the block, Pastor Reeves' charity beds, in exchange for domestic labor, which meant working for a woman named Edna Reeves, who had a reputation for extracting maximum value from charity cases before declaring them recovered. The alley between the saddle shop and the assay office, an overhang perhaps 3 feet of cover, inadequate against any serious precipitation. The livery stable on the cross street, warm, occupied by horses and a stableman named Potts, who would want something for the use of the space. She had been homeless for approximately 40 minutes. She was already thinking like someone who had been homeless for months. "You're Neil Calloway's girl." The voice came from her left, from a bench against the front wall of the store, where an old man sat so still she had walked past without seeing him. He was wearing furs that had aged to the softness of old cloth. Layers of them, the practical insulation of someone who had spent decades in high country and stopped caring how it looked. His beard was white and reached his chest. His hands rested on his knees like implements set aside. After use, the skin darkened to the color of old saddle leather. His eyes were pale gray, completely still, the kind of eyes that have spent a very long time reading things that don't announce themselves. Wren turned to face him. He died 3 weeks ago. I heard." He didn't offer condolences, and the absence of them was not unkind. It was the acknowledgement of someone who understood that condolences at 3 weeks' distance were mostly for the speaker. "That Durst woman throw you out? The law says the farm is hers." The old man looked at her sack, then at her face, with the evaluative attention of someone reading terrain. "Law and justice have always been different animals in this county." He pushed himself to standing, a movement that required negotiation but completed itself with dignity. He was perhaps 6 feet tall, with the stoop that decades of working in low spaces produced, a particular curvature of the upper spine that spoke of mine shafts and crawl spaces. "Name's Coot Egan. Spent 30 years working claims in the Moreno Valley. Your father helped me once. My mule went lame on the South Road about 8 years back. He stopped and helped me get her to the farrier and didn't ask for payment and didn't make me feel the weight of needing help." He picked up a walking stick that had been leaning against the wall beside him. "How much money do you have?" 23 cents. He nodded as if she had confirmed a hypothesis he'd already formed. "You have somewhere to sleep tonight." "I'm looking into my options." His expression said clearly that he understood exactly what that meant and that he was not deceived by it. "Come with me. I want to show you something. You have no reason to trust me, and good reason to be cautious, but I'm 73 years old, and my back gave out 2 winters ago, so the threat I represent is largely theoretical." He turned west without waiting for her answer and began walking. Wren picked up her sack and followed. The practical calculation took about 4 seconds. The temperature was dropping. Every visible option in Cimarron cost money she didn't have, or labor she wasn't certain she wanted to owe. Coot Egan moved like a man who knew where he was going, which was more than she could say for herself at that moment. But underneath the practical calculation was something less quantifiable. He had spoken to her as one competent adult speaks to another without pity, without the particular condescension that attached itself to young women in reduced circumstances, without any of the performances that charity required. She was hungrier for that than she had understood until it appeared. He led her west out of Cimarron along a trail that was less a trail than a series of intentions between the juniper and pinon, winding uphill through outcroppings of pale limestone into the low hills that rose toward the Cimarron Range. The snow had begun to settle on north-facing rock. The afternoon light was going the color of old pewter. Wren kept her eyes on Coot's back and read the terrain as she walked, cataloging water drainage and wind exposure and fuel availability with the automatic attention of someone who had grown up farming marginal land. They climbed for the better part of an hour. The town disappeared behind successive ridgelines. The wind increased as they gained elevation, pushing cold air down from the high country with a persistence that said this was not a temporary condition. She thought about margins. Her father had talked about margins constantly, the difference between what you needed to survive a bad season and what you actually had, the distance between those two numbers being the thing that determined whether a family was still farming in the spring. He had spent 30 years keeping that margin positive. The medical bills had finally closed it. Coot stopped on a rock shelf above a shallow draw and stood looking at a section of hillside that presented itself as nothing. A loose screen of dead cedar branches leaned against the rock face in an arrangement that wind and time produce constantly in this country, the casual disorder of natural accumulation. He reached out and moved the nearest branch aside with a practiced motion. Then another, then three more, moving them with the efficiency of someone performing a familiar sequence, each branch going to a specific location, the whole operation completed in under a minute. Behind the branches, the rock face held an opening. 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall, the edges smoothed by centuries of water movement. The limestone around it was pale cream-colored, veined with gray. Smaller stones had been arranged at the threshold at some point in the past, a low, deliberate border that felt like intention without being formal. Beyond it was complete dark. "Found this in 1848, Coot said without particular drama. "I was 25 and lost in a December storm. I was following a warm spring creek uphill on the logic that heat rises and hot water confirms where it comes from. I've spent 3 winters in here across the years. Never told anyone it existed." He looked at her directly. Some things are too useful to share with people who turn useful things into spectacles. He stepped inside. Wren followed him into the dark. The change was immediate. Not just temperature, though. The temperature changed within the first 10 feet. The cold October air replaced by something warmer and moist, the way air feels in the vicinity of a kitchen where something has been simmering through the afternoon. She smelled minerals, a struck flint quality, something beneath that, like a creek bank in late summer. She kept her hand on the wall and followed the sound of Coot's footsteps. The tunnel ran straight for perhaps 30 feet, narrow enough to feel the walls with elbows out, but not enough to feel trapped ceiling a few inches above her head. Then the tunnel ended and the space opened. She heard it before she saw it, the way large spaces announce themselves through sound, a change in the quality of darkness, a sense of volume. Coot struck a match and held it up, and the chamber assembled itself around her in the wavering light. 40 feet across, 20 feet high at the dome, the ceiling curved upward with the completeness of something that had formed without assistance over a period of time too long to comprehend. The floor was flat stone worn to the polish that only moving water and centuries of time produces. Along the near wall, a sequence of natural ledges stepped upward in the rock. Against the far wall, the stone darkened with permanent moisture. In the center of the floor, a pool perhaps 12 feet in diameter moved with the particular agitation of water that is going somewhere, driven by pressure from below. Steam rose from the surface, not dramatically, not in the way of a performance, in the quiet, persistent way of something that has been doing this for longer than memory and intends to continue regardless of whether anyone is present to observe it. The match went out. Wren stood in the dark and felt the warmth against her face, the way you feel sunlight through a window in January, the specific sensation of heat that you did not generate and do not have to maintain. "Hot spring," Coot said. 104 degrees at the source. The pool runs around 95 at the surface where it's cooled some. The water heats the air. The stone absorbs the heat and holds it the way a hearthstone holds heat after the fire dies. He crossed to the pool in the dark, moving from memory. 58 degrees in here last February when the temperature outside was 34 below. I know because I had a thermometer and too much time and not enough to occupy myself with. Ren walked to the pool's edge. She held her hand above the surface and felt the heat rising against her palm. Steady, unhurried. Not the aggressive heat of something burning, but the deep, persistent warmth of something that has been at this for millennia and found a rhythm that works. The chill she had been carrying in her chest since the morning her father stopped recognizing her voice began to release incrementally, the way ice leaves a river in March, not all at once, but steadily from the edges first. The earth had been warm this whole time. She simply hadn't known where to stand. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. Coots settled onto a flat boulder near the pool with the careful movement of someone whose joints require advanced negotiation. "Your father helped me when he had nothing to gain from it and didn't make me feel the size of needing help. I've been carrying that debt 8 years. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm 73. My knees are finished with climbing. Another winter or two and this walk will be beyond me. Someone should know this place exists. Someone who needs it." He looked at her across the darkness of the chamber. Not someone who will sell the knowledge of it or make it famous. Someone who will use it the way it deserves to be used. "You're giving me a cave. I'm showing you one. What you build from it is entirely your work." He walked her through the chamber, then using the confident navigation of someone who had memorized this space across decades. The sleeping area was a flat section of floor near the pool where the stone had absorbed so much heat over so many years that it held warmth the way bread holds heat from the oven after you take it out. The storage alcove was a natural recession in the east wall 6 feet deep and reliably dry. The pool was safe to drink from at the far edge where the water had cooled after flowing away from the main source. Somewhere above the dome, a natural shaft penetrated 40 feet of limestone to the surface, a chimney that the water vapor used to exit, keeping the air in the chamber breathable. "The ventilation is why it doesn't feel like a steam bath," Coote said. "The air moves just enough. I've never had trouble breathing in here. The spring has never stopped. The temperature has never varied more than 2 degrees in any winter I've spent inside it. The earth doesn't have off days." He helped her build the entrance seal that evening, moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone executing a plan he had prepared in advance. From the deep storage alcove, he produced materials he had cached across the years against future need: heavy canvas cured hide strips, a coil of wire. They built a frame of juniper branches cut from the hillside immediately outside, stretching the canvas tight across it and weighting the bottom with flat stones. The hide strips closed the gaps where wind could push through. The whole structure fit exactly in the entrance, as if the entrance had been designed for it, which it hadn't, but the measurements of practical necessity often align with natural openings in the world. When they finished, the outside air was sealed away completely. The temperature inside did not change. It did not need to. Coote sat with her for an hour after the seal was in place, drinking hot spring water from the cool edge of the pool and talking about the mechanics of geothermal systems with the unhurried precision of a man who has spent a lifetime learning how things work at depth. He explained how water percolated down through fractured limestone until it reached rock heated by the Earth's interior, how the pressure differential drove it back up, how the temperature at the surface reflected the temperature at depth, which reflected a geological reality that no surface winter could reach or alter. He explained it the way her father had explained surveying, assuming she was capable of understanding and not bothering to check. Before he left, already at the entrance with his walking stick in hand, he turned back into the chamber. "One more thing. There is a parcel in the Ute Creek Valley 9 miles south, 40 acres. Your father purchased it in 1860 from his own money, before Mabel, before the farm mortgage, and he registered it in your name alone the day you turned 21 in the spring of 1881. It is not part of the farm. It is not covered by his will. It has nothing to do with Mabel Durst." He held her gaze. "Check the wooden box. Look under everything else." He left. The canvas entrance seal swung back into place behind him. The chamber returned to its own sounds, the movement of water, the barely audible sigh of air moving through the limestone shaft above the particular quality of silence that belongs to underground spaces. Ren opened the wooden box. She lifted out the flannel-wrapped ring. She lifted out the lock of hair with its red thread. She lifted the paper from the bottom of the box and unfolded it and held it toward the faint luminescence of the pool's surface. It was dated March 4th, 1881, the month she had turned 21. It carried the stamp of Colfax County. It recorded the transfer of 40 acres in the Ute Creek Valley to Ren May Calloway, of lawful age, her name and no other. Her father had purchased the land 2 decades earlier from his own savings and held it in trust until the day she was legally old enough to own it outright. He had said nothing to her about any of it. He had placed the deed beneath everything else in a wooden box he knew she would carry out of the house without knowing what she was carrying. She sat with the paper for a long time. Outside, the snow was building towards something. She could feel it in the particular way the air pressure had changed, even inside the sealed chamber, a subtle shift that her body registered before her mind could name it. She had grown up reading this country's weather through the walls of a farmhouse, and she was reading it now through 40 feet of limestone. And what she read was the signature of a winter that had committed itself. The pool moved beside her. The steam rose, the stone held its heat. She thought about her father registering that deed in her name on the day she turned 21, saying nothing for the 5 years that followed, filing it in a wooden box under a wedding ring and a lock of hair, leaving it for her to find after everything else was gone. She thought about what kind of love operated on that kind of patience, that kind of long-range preparation. She thought about what he must have seen in Mabel that made him arrange a separate escape route for his daughter without telling his daughter it existed. He had known. He had known what Mabel was, and he had known what the will would do, and he couldn't change the will without losing the money he needed to survive long enough to see one more spring. So he had arranged the one thing he could arrange that Mabel could not inherit, could not consume, could not burn for warmth. She folded the deed carefully. She put it back in the box beneath the ring and the hair. She put the box in the storage alcove against the dry back wall. She spread her grandmother's quilt on the warm flat stone near the pool and lay down on it and pulled it around her shoulders. The warmth came up through the stone. It came down through the air. It rose from the water 2 feet away with the absolute consistency of something that had been making the same offering since before the first person walked into this valley and long after the last one would leave. Outside, snow was falling on Colfax County. It was falling on the farmhouse that now belonged to Mabel Durst. It was falling on the boarding house where 50 cents bought a drafty room. It was falling on the church where charity came with conditions. It was falling on every doorway she had cataloged that morning, measuring cover, calculating inadequacy. None of it was falling on her. She closed her eyes. The stone was warm beneath her. The air was warm around her. For the first time since she had sat beside her father's bed listening to his breathing become uncertain, and then stop, she was not cold. She did not think about what Mabel would do when she had time to go through the remaining paperwork. She did not think about Tanner Briggs and what kind of legal arguments a determined woman with money might purchase. She did not think about the 40 acres in the Ute Creek Valley and who else might look at a deed and see an opportunity. Those thoughts were waiting for her in the morning. Tonight the earth was enough. Tonight the earth was everything. She slept. November came in like a door slamming shut. The snow that had fallen tentatively through October hardened into something with conviction, accumulating on the Cimarron Range in layers that the wind compacted into dense shelves overhanging the north faces of every ridge. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the first week of November and did not recover. Wren knew what this meant. She had watched enough November skies from the farmhouse to understand the difference between a difficult winter and one that intended to be remembered. This one intended to be remembered. She spent the first 2 weeks of the month building. The storage alcove became a proper larder. She gathered late rose hips from the draws below the cave, stripping the canes before the cold took them entirely, filling a cloth bag she had sewn from the hem of an extra shirt. She found dry juniper berries on the sheltered south slopes. She boiled pine needles in hot spring water and drank the tea for the nutrients Coot had told her it contained, a trick he had learned from 30 years of high country winters when scurvy was a practical concern rather than a historical footnote. She set 6 rabbit snares now, instead of 3, rotating them across different draws to avoid overhunting any single population. She cut and stacked fuel near the entrance for the small cooking fires she used when the hot spring temperature alone wasn't sufficient, though those occasions were rarer than she had expected. The cooking system she had developed in October refined itself through November into something that felt almost elegant. The hot spring water at the cooling edge of the pool ran consistently near 140 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cook cornmeal to edibility in 20 minutes, to soften dried jerky into something that could be eaten without risking a tooth, to steep the pine needle tea that kept her body functioning the way it needed to function. She suspended a tin bucket from a juniper branch frame directly above the hottest section of the pool's outflow channel, where the temperature held at 160 degrees, and discovered she could hard cook eggs in it in 12 minutes. She had traded for 6 eggs in Cimarron in late October, and she rationed them with the attention of someone who understood that 6 eggs represented something beyond nutrition. She ate better than she had expected. She stayed warmer than anyone in the county had reason to predict. On the 14th of November, she walked into Cimarron for the second time since October. She carried 3 rabbit pelts and a fourth that had been split and restretched to present its full surface. The man at the general store, whose name she had learned was Harker, looked at the pelts with the evaluative eye of someone who has bought inferior work before and is prepared to say so. These were not inferior. She had learned to skin and prepare furs from her father, who had learned from a trapper named Beaumont, who had worked the Moreno Valley in the 1850s, and the pelts were clean, evenly stretched, properly dried. Harker looked at them for a long moment. He offered a fair price, which surprised her, and she took it without negotiating, because she had learned early that arguing with a fair offer was a way of turning a potential ally into a grudging one. She was coming out of the store with flour salt, a tin of rendered lard, and a small paper of dried beans when she saw Mabel's wagon parked in front of the land office. Not the general store this time, the land office. Wren stopped on the sidewalk. The land office occupied a narrow building between the barbershop and the telegraph station. Its door was closed. Through the single window, she could see the shape of a man behind a desk and the shape of a woman sitting across from him, gray-haired, upright in the particular way of someone conducting business they have prepared for. Wren stood on the sidewalk for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough to confirm what she was seeing, then walked east along the main street at a pace that would not attract attention. She thought about this wooden box in the storage alcove. She thought about the Colfax County stamp on the deed dated March 4th, 1881. She thought about Tanner Briggs, the thin lawyer who had read her father's will in a flat voice, who was presumably still available for hire to anyone who wanted legal work done with a minimum of visible conscience. Mabel had been going through the paperwork. That evening, alone in the cave with the pool moving beside her, Wren opened the wooden box. She unfolded the deed and read it again, the full text this time, every phrase, every legal reference. Her name was on it unambiguously. The parcel was described by metes and bounds in the standard survey language she had grown up reading. The purchase price paid in full was recorded. The signature was her father's, witnessed by a notary whose stamp she could feel with her fingertip, the raised impression of an official seal. It was a real document. It was her land. But she was 23 years old with no money for a lawyer, no political connections in the county, no husband whose name carried social weight, no history in Cimarron that predated the history of the farm that now belonged to someone else. She knew what legal contests looked like when one party had resources and the other had a deed and a tin cup. She had seen enough of her father's dealings with the bank to understand that rightness and outcomes were not the same category. She folded the deed. She put it back under the ring and the hair. She lay on the warm stone and looked at the dome of the chamber above her. The ceiling that water had spent 1,000 years smoothing into that particular curve, and she thought about what her father had done. He had held that land in trust for 21 years, waiting for the day she was old enough to own it. He had registered it in her name the month she turned 21 and said nothing. He had prepared this, every piece of it. She was still thinking about that when she fell asleep. The conversation with Coot came 9 days later on a gray afternoon when he arrived at the cave entrance with a cloth bag over one shoulder and his walking stick in his other hand, moving more slowly than he had in October. The cold was making itself felt in his knees in a way he didn't comment on, but that she could see in the extra deliberateness of his footwork on the trail. He came inside and she gave him hot spring tea, and he sat on the boulder near the pool and told her what he had heard. Tanner Briggs had filed a motion with the Colfax County Court on the 12th of November on behalf of Mabel Durst Calloway. The motion argued that the 40 acres in the Ute Creek Valley, though registered in Wren's name, had been purchased using household funds from a marriage that legally merged the financial assets of both parties. Therefore, Mabel's legal inheritance of all marital assets included the Ute Creek parcel. A hearing was scheduled for the first week of March. Wren would need to appear to contest the claim, or the motion would proceed uncontested. Wren listened to this without speaking. She watched the steam rise from the pool, and she calculated. First week of March was 16 weeks away. 16 weeks in which Mabel would have a lawyer preparing arguments, and she would have a deed, a tin cup savings grown somewhat through the rabbit pelt trade, and the problem of finding legal representation in a county where everyone who practiced law either knew Briggs or owed him something. She knows about the Ute Creek land, Wren said. She knows about it. Coot sipped his tea. She's been very thorough. He looked at her steadily. She doesn't know about this cave. She doesn't know how you've been living. She expected you to be broken by now or gone or willing to settle for something small just to make the pressure stop. Wren thought about the expression on Mabel's face in October outside the general store, the way surprise had moved through confusion towards something that looked almost like uncertainty. Mabel had needed her to be diminished. Mabel had built her entire strategy around Wren's diminishment being the natural and inevitable outcome. A young woman with nothing in the worst winter in territorial history, sleeping in doorways and eating charity food, would not have the resources or the will to contest a legal motion filed by an experienced widow with a hired lawyer. That was the calculation. It was a reasonable calculation. It was based on entirely accurate information about Wren's circumstances. It had failed to account for one variable. I have the deed, Wren said. The original. My father signed it, witness sealed by the county notary. Whatever Briggs argues about marital funds, the registration predates the marriage by nearly 3 years. The land was purchased 2 decades before Mabel ever set foot in the Mora Valley. I know. Coot set down his cup. But Briggs will argue the funds used came from savings that became marital property retroactively under territorial inheritance law. It's a weak argument, but a weak argument heard by a sympathetic judge is worth more than a strong argument heard by nobody. He paused. You need to be in that courtroom in March. You need the deed in your hand. You need someone who can speak to the circumstances of the transfer. She looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching. I was in the county clerk's office on March 4th, 1881, Coot said, filing paperwork on a mining claim dispute of my own. I saw your father complete the transfer of that deed into your name. I saw the notary stamp it. I remember it because I remember thinking it was an unusual thing, a father registering 40 acres in his daughter's name while his own farm was carrying debt. He looked at the pool. I didn't know him well enough then to understand why he did it. I understand now. Wren felt something settle in her chest, a weight she had been carrying at an angle that made it harder to bear. You'd testify. It wasn't a question. If it came to that, he picked up his cup again. It won't come to that. A deed registered in your name on your 21st birthday with a county seal and a notary stamp and a purchase date 2 decades before the marriage will hold. Briggs knows it will hold. He's making Mabel spend money on a case he already knows the outcome of, which tells you something about Tanner Briggs. December arrived and the winter abandoned all pretense of moderation. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero on December 4th and then kept dropping. Snow fell for 6 consecutive days and then stopped, and the sky cleared to the hard, brilliant blue of deep cold, which was in its own way worse than the snow, because the clear nights bled heat from the earth at a rate that the cloud cover had been preventing, and the mornings arrived with temperatures that made metal brittle. Wren checked her snares at dawn each day, and the cold was a physical force she moved through rather than weather she experienced. She was dressed for it, layered in everything she owned, plus a rabbit-skin vest she had sewn from the pelts she hadn't traded, and the cold reached her, but did not stop her. She walked into Cimarron twice in December, each time to trade pelts and hear what the town was saying about the winter. What the town was saying was that it had never been this bad, and it was only December. The hardware store had run out of stovepipe fittings because 3 families had replaced their stoves trying to get more heat out of less fuel. The boarding house had added 2 cots to every room and was turning people away. The price of firewood had tripled from October to December and was still climbing. On the second December visit, coming out of Harker's store with a small paper of dried apricots, she had allowed herself as an extravagance. She came face to face with Mabel on the sidewalk. This was not the managed distance of October, Mabel elevated on a wagon seat and Wren standing below. This was 4 feet of sidewalk plank between them, eye level, the cold pressing in from all sides. Mabel was wearing her dead husband's fur coat with the collar turned up, and her face above it had a quality Wren hadn't seen there before. Not cruelty, not contempt, something more stripped of performance. The cold does that to people. It removes the layers that aren't structural. You look well. Mabel's voice was flat with something that wasn't quite surprise. Better than you should. It's been a good autumn. Wren tucked the apricots into her coat pocket. Mabel's eyes moved over her with the systematic attention of someone checking her original assessment against current evidence. Where are you sleeping, Harker's back room? Somewhere warm. Nothing out there is warm. I've burned through 14 cords of wood and it's only December. The number carried its own alarm. 14 cords by December represented a rate of consumption that would exhaust a normal winter supply before February. Wren looked at her. She thought about the cave, the pool, the warm stone, the 58 degrees that had not varied once in the weeks she had lived inside it. She thought about the deed in the wooden box and the legal motion filed on the 12th of November, and Tanner Briggs sitting in his office constructing arguments on behalf of a woman burning through her money at a rate she hadn't calculated. That sounds expensive, Wren said. Mabel's jaw tightened. Comfort costs what it costs. It certainly does. Wren stepped around her on the sidewalk. Good day, Mabel. Stay warm. She walked east toward the hills and did not look back. The feeling she carried home was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated, the recognition that the woman who had taken her home was spending herself into a corner she hadn't seen coming, and that the outcome Wren was watching accumulate was not one she had engineered, but one that Mabel was building herself. One cord of overpriced wood at a time, with the methodical blindness of someone who had confused comfort with security. The real catastrophe arrived on January 9th, 1887. Wren was inside the cave when the storm began, and she had been inside it long enough to have developed a sensitivity to pressure changes that the sealed entrance could not entirely block. The barometric drop she felt in the early afternoon of January 8th was the steepest she had ever experienced. She spent the remainder of that day moving everything stored near the entrance, further back into the alcove, and reinforcing the entrance seal with an additional layer of juniper branches wired across the outside of the canvas. She filled every container she had with water from the pool's cool edge. She checked her food stores and calculated margins. She was ready when the storm came. It arrived after midnight, announced first by a sound like the entire mountain range, exhaling a low sustained pressure against the hillside that built in volume until it was the only sound in the world. Snow drove horizontally against the rock face outside. She could feel it in the vibration of the sealed entrance, a drumming that came in waves as the gusts peaked. Inside the chamber, the temperature did not change. The pool moved with the same unhurried agitation it always showed. The air shaft somewhere above the dome continued its quiet circulation, the system operating exactly as it had operated for 10,000 years, regardless of what the surface was doing. She slept through the worst of it. In the morning, she went to check the entrance and found it immovable. Not stuck, not frozen, buried. The snow had drifted against the hillside in a wave that had encountered the cedar branch screen and the canvas and stopped there, piling up behind and above, until the entrance was sealed from the outside by a wall of compacted snow. She estimated at 6 feet thick, based on the sound her fist made against the canvas when she struck it, and the resistance of the whole structure when she pushed. She was sealed inside a cave. She stood at the entrance for a long moment, her hand flat against the cold canvas, and she assessed her situation with the systematic attention her father had taught her to apply to problems before applying emotion. Air shaft functioning, she could confirm this by the continued circulation of the chamber atmosphere. Water supply, unlimited, the pool beside her. Food supply, dried rabbit cornmeal apricots, pine needle tea, approximately 10 days at normal consumption, potentially 14 at reduced. Fuel adequate for small fires if needed. Temperature unchanged at 58 degrees. The snow was not a threat to the chamber's structural integrity. Limestone does not compress under snow load the way timber does. She was not in danger. She was inconvenienced. The distinction mattered. She held it in her mind deliberately, the way you hold a lamp in a dark room, not letting it waver. She spent the first day mapping the chamber in precise detail, something she had done approximately, but never formally. She paced the dimensions, noted the variations in ceiling height, identified the exact location of the ventilation shaft by tracing the air movement with wet fingertips. She found in the back of the storage alcove behind her, cached supplies, a mark on the stone wall that Coote had left. Two initials, CE, scratched into the limestone with something sharp, and below them a date, 1848, the year he had found this place while lost in a December storm. Below that, in letters smaller and less confident, as if added later, the words, "It was enough." She ran her finger across those words. She thought about a 25-year-old man crawling out of a blizzard into a chamber like this, finding heat and water and shelter where there should have been nothing, and carving those three words into the stone as the most accurate description available. She took out the hand auger she had packed in October. On the second day of her confinement, she began digging. Not in panic, in the systematic way of someone executing a plan that had already been thought through. She worked at the snowpack from the inside, pushing the auger through the canvas and into the snow, and rotating it to pull snow back through the hole she was making. The work was slow, the snowpack was dense, but the auger was designed for harder materials than compacted snow, and it did what it was asked to do, incrementally producing a channel that grew inward toward the outer face of the drift. On the fourth day, she broke through. The auger tip emerged into cold air and gray light, and the particular sensation of that emergence, the shift from resistance to nothing, from enclosed to open, was the most vivid physical experience she could remember, since her father had taken her hand in his final days and held it with a grip that surprised her with its remaining strength. She widened the channel with her hands, pulling snow back through the entrance, working outward. By midday, she had a passage 18 inches in diameter, running through 6 feet of packed snow, enough to crawl through on her stomach with her arms extended in front of her. She emerged onto a hillside that was not the hillside she remembered. The snow had reorganized the entire terrain. Every familiar reference point was either buried or transformed. The juniper she had used as a landmark was visible only as a shape beneath a white dome. The draw where she ran her snares was a smooth, undifferentiated slope. The sky above was clear, brilliant, the deep cold blue of January at high elevation, and the air against her face after 4 days inside was so sharp it felt like a correction. She checked her snares. 3 of them were buried completely and would need to be relocated. One had caught a rabbit frozen solid, which she extracted and carried back through the snow tunnel into the cave. She reset the 3 accessible snares in new locations. She rebuilt the entrance seal, reinforcing the buried section with additional material to prevent another complete blockage. Then she sat at the edge of the pool and ate frozen rabbit thawed in hot spring water, and thought about what 4 days inside the earth had demonstrated. It had demonstrated something she had known intellectually, but now understood in the way that only physical experience produces understanding. The cave did not need her to do anything to remain warm. She did not need to manage it, feed it, tend it, or worry about its fuel supply. She did not need to do anything at all except be present in it. The Earth's heat was not a resource that could be depleted. It was not subject to price increases or supply shortages or the judgment of bankers. It did not know there was a surface, and it did not care what was happening on it. She had survived 4 days of the worst storm in Colfax County's recorded history inside a geothermal chamber heated by forces that predated the county, the territory, the nation, the entire human project on this continent. She had not been cold once. She had not burned a single piece of wood. Outside the territory was learning what the winter of 1887 intended to be. She did not know the specific details yet. She would learn them in March when she walked back into Cimarron and found out what the storm had cost the people who had spent it in houses. But she could calculate the general shape of it from what she knew about the temperature, the duration, the price of firewood in December, and the rate at which a woman like Mabel Durst burned through money when she had a fixed supply and an appetite for comfort that the circumstances could not support. Coote arrived in the 3rd week of January, moving on the packed snow trail with the careful deliberateness of a man who had decided to make this climb regardless of what his knees thought about it. He came inside and she gave him hot tea and looked at his face and saw something there that was not his usual composed assessment. He told her what the 3 weeks since the storm had confirmed. Several families in the county had burned through their winter wood supply entirely. 2 families on the North Range had lost their cattle herds, every animal frozen where they stood in a night that dropped to 41 below. The railroad spur into Cimarron had been shut since December, and supply wagons couldn't get through the drifted roads, which meant the general store was rationing flour. A man named Purvis, who lived 4 miles east of town, had been found in his kitchen on January 14th, 3 days after the storm, frozen at the table with his coat on and his stove empty, and a letter to his sister in Missouri left half-finished in front of him. Wren listened to all of this. She kept her face neutral. It was not callousness. It was the discipline of someone who has understood that emotion spent on the unchangeable past is emotion not available for the challenges still ahead. "Mabel," she asked. Coot looked at the pool, still in the farmhouse, but Harker says she came in before the storm and bought the last 4 cords of seasoned wood in his lot at winter price, which was 3 times the October price. He paused. "The farm has a mortgage note at the Cimarron Bank. Your father took it out in 1883 to cover the first year of medical bills before Mabel entered the picture. The payments have continued since. They fall due in February." He looked at her directly. I don't know if she understood the full debt structure when she took the inheritance. A lawyer like Briggs billing by the hour to explain assets may not have been equally thorough about liabilities. Wren thought about how a farm looked on paper when you were evaluating it as a prize rather than as a responsibility. She thought about what Mabel had seen when Briggs described the estate: land, livestock, equipment, a house. She thought about what Mabel had not been told or had not thought to ask. "She may not have," Wren said. "She may not have." Coot accepted the second cup of tea she poured from the edge of the pool. "The hearing is March 5th, Cimarron Courthouse. You'll need to be there regardless of what the snow is doing." Wren thought about 11 miles of drifted road in late winter, the possibility of another storm, the certainty that Tanner Briggs would have prepared a thorough argument for a case he privately knew he wouldn't win. She thought about walking into a courtroom at 23 years old in a rabbit-skin vest with a deed in her coat pocket and telling a county judge that the land was hers. Her father had planned for this moment. He had put her name on that deed the day she turned 21, 5 years before it mattered. He had kept it in a box he knew she would carry. He had trusted that she would understand what it was when she found it. She was not going to fail the patience that had gone into that preparation. "I'll be there," she said. February moved through the county like a debt collector making final rounds. More livestock lost. More families burning things they had intended to sell in spring. Wren marked each day in a small notebook she had traded a rabbit pelt for in December, recording the temperature outside as best she could estimate it from the behavior of the ice on the pool's channel, edges the state of her snares, the depth of the snow. Inside the cave, the temperature never varied. The pool moved. The air circulated. The stone held its warmth with the indifference of something that has never needed to be asked. She had been inside this warmth for 4 months. She had mapped the cave so completely she could navigate it blindfolded, which she occasionally did as a test. She had organized the storage alcove with a precision that reflected the way her mind had come to work in the cave's quiet, a careful attention to order that was partly practical and partly something else, a response to having everything taken. When you have very little, you tend very carefully to what you have. On the last day of February, she found something in the fresh snowfall outside the cave entrance. Footprints, coming up the trail from the west side of the draw, not from the main trail she used. They approached the cedar branch screen. They stopped there. Then they retreated back down the hill the way they had come. The prints were made by a man's boot, large with a heel that dug in deeply on the uphill steps. They were fresh, no more than a day old, the edges still crisp. Someone had come to the entrance. Someone had looked at the cedar screen. Someone had turned around. Wren crouched in the snow and studied the prints for a long time. She noted the length, the stride pattern, the way the heel engaged on the slope. These were not a trapper's prints. A trapper moved differently on a hillside with the practiced weight distribution of someone accustomed to uneven terrain. These were the prints of someone who worked primarily on flat or measured ground, whose body was trained for different surfaces, who was not entirely comfortable with the angle of this particular slope. A man from town, a man with a specific professional reason to be surveying this hillside. She went back inside. She reinforced the entrance seal with an additional layer of cedar branches on the inside wired across the canvas in a way that would not be visible from outside, but that would add resistance against any attempt to pull the cover away. She checked the position of her skinning knife in the alcove close to where she slept. She did not tell herself a story about the footprints that made them smaller than they were, because she had learned that making threats smaller than they are is how unprepared people become people who look back and say they should have seen it coming. She had 9 days until the March 5th hearing. The footprints stayed in her mind the way a splinter stays in a fingertip, not debilitating, but continuously present, a small, sharp signal from a situation not yet understood. She had a deed, she had a witness, she had a hearing date. She had lived through a winter that had broken the finances and the spirit of people who had believed their stoves and their firewood would be enough. She had all of that. The footprints said that someone else had something too. She just didn't know yet what it was. She left the cave before dawn on March 5th. The cold was the specific cold of late winter at elevation. Not the killing cold of January, but the cold of a season that has not yet decided to relent, that holds its position the way a stubborn man holds a doorway, not threatening to advance, but refusing to yield. Wren wore everything she owned in Layer's rabbit skin vest beneath her coat, the quilt folded and left behind in the alcove, because she was not carrying comfort. Today she was carrying the deed in her inside coat pocket, where her body heat would keep the paper from becoming brittle, and the wooden box itself she left in the alcove beneath the ring and the hair because she needed only the document, not the weight of everything that surrounded it. 11 miles to Cimarron on packed snow that had crusted overnight to a surface that supported her weight in some places and collapsed without warning in others, sending her knee-deep into the drift beneath the crust. She knew this trail. She had walked it 6 times since October in both directions and in 3 different weather conditions. She set out at 4 in the morning, and she walked steadily, not fast, the pace of someone conserving energy over a distance rather than covering ground as quickly as possible. The sky above the Cimarron Range was the deep pre-dawn black that holds the stars longer than any other sky, and she could see them clearly in the cold, dry air, the familiar constellations her father had named for her from the farmhouse porch across years of clear autumn nights. She thought about him as she walked, not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with a quality of attention that was its own kind of tribute. She thought about the deed he had filed in her name on the day she turned 21. 5 years before it mattered, when the shape of the future uncertainty had not yet taken Mabel's specific form, but had been visible on the horizon in the way that certain kinds of loss become visible to a man watching his own health decline. He had been a man who set his fence post deeper than the county standard. He had been a man who thought in terms of margins and what happens when margins close. He had looked at his own diminishment coming and had taken the one action available to him that Mabel could not inherit, could not consume, could not burn for warmth. He had given Wren 40 acres and said nothing about it. He had trusted her to find it when she needed it. He had trusted her to know what to do with it when she did. She arrived in Cimarron as the sun was clearing the eastern mesa, pale winter light lying flat across the snow-covered main street. The town looked smaller than she remembered it looking in October, compressed by the winter into something more concentrated and worn. The storefronts had the battered quality of structures that had been asked to do more than they were built for. Wood piles that should have been substantial were visibly depleted. The livery stable had a new section of wall replaced in green lumber, the pale wood bright against the weathered boards of the original structure, evidence of something that had failed in the cold and been repaired with whatever was available. Dolph Crane was coming out of the lunch counter when Wren reached the main street. He stopped on the step when he saw her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that contradicts a firm expectation. Then he stepped down from the boardwalk and crossed the street. "Miss Calloway?" His voice carried something she hadn't heard from him in October. "Where did you spend the winter?" "Somewhere warm." He looked at her face, the color in it, the clarity of her eyes, the absence of the hollow exhaustion that marked everyone who had spent 5 months fighting the cold with fuel and money. "You look better than half the people in this county." He said the words carrying the tone of a man stating an observable fact that he finds faintly troubling. "I had good shelter." He nodded slowly. "The hearing is in an hour. Briggs was in the lunch counter this morning going over his papers." He paused. "Your stepmother was with him." He said it the way you say something you think a person should know. Wren thanked him. She went to the courthouse. The Colfax County Courthouse was a 2-story stone building at the east end of the main street, solid in the way of buildings constructed by people who intended to stay. The hearing room on the ground floor held 2 tables, a judge's bench, a gallery of 8 wooden chairs, a wood stove in the corner burning with the concentrated attention of something that was the only reason the room was habitable. Judge Aldous Prentice sat behind the bench with his coat on, a heavy-set man in his 60s, whose reputation in the county was for thoroughness rather than speed, which was either reassuring or worrying, depending on which side of a case you were on. Tanner Briggs sat at the left table with a leather case open in front of him, papers arranged with the precision of someone who had spent the previous evening ordering them. He was dressed in a dark suit that acknowledged the formality of the proceeding in a way that was itself an argument about the seriousness of his client's position. Mabel sat beside him in the gray wool coat she had worn in October, not the fur coat, the fur having perhaps been sold or set aside as circumstances required. Her face when she turned to look at Wren enter the room showed nothing that Wren could read. Mabel had managed her expressions back to neutrality. Whatever the winter had cost her, she had not let it show on her face this morning. Coot Egan sat in the gallery behind Wren's table. He had a clean shirt on. He nodded once when she came in. The hearing began at 9. Prentice established the matter for the record, the petition of Mabel Durst Calloway, contesting the deed of 40 acres in the Ute Creek Valley, registered in the name of Wren May Calloway, motion filed November 12, 1886. He invited Briggs to present. Briggs was thorough. He had done the research. He presented the argument that Neil Calloway's transfer of the Ute Creek parcel into Wren's name had been made possible by a financial stability that Mabel's subsequent contributions had helped maintain, and that the legal framework of the territory treated certain assets as partially communal when they had benefited from what Briggs called marital investment. He spoke for 20 minutes. He cited 3 territorial precedents, each read into the record by name and date. Wren listened to all of it. She had not hired a lawyer. She could not afford one. She was going to speak for herself, which was not conventional, and which Prentice had already raised an eyebrow about when she informed him of the situation before the proceedings began. He had not prevented her. She was of legal age. The territory's provisions were clear on that point. When Briggs finished, Prentice looked at Wren. "Your response, Miss Calloway." She placed the deed on the table in front of her. Then she stood up. She had prepared what she intended to say with the same attention she had given to organizing the storage alcove, each element in the order it would be needed. She began with the date March 4th, 1881, the day she turned 21. She noted that the land itself had been purchased by her father in 1860, 24 years before Neil Calloway ever met Mabel Durst, held in trust for his daughter until she reached lawful age. She noted the county seal on the document, the notary's stamp, the witness signature of the county clerk. She noted that the registration named Wren May Calloway as sole owner with no encumbrances, listed no liens, no conditions, no reversionary clauses. She noted that territorial law on premarital property was explicit assets registered before a marriage, in a name other than the future spouse's, were not subject to inheritance claims arising from that subsequent marriage. Then she said, "Mr. Briggs has argued that my stepmother's financial contributions stabilize the asset base from which this parcel derives value. I want to note for the record that the Ute Creek land is 40 acres of unimproved valley ground purchased by my father before the war between the states. Its value derives from the land itself, not from any household expenditure made by anyone who arrived in the Calloway household in 1884. Whatever Mabel Durst contributed to that household, she contributed it to a farm that has its own deed, its own registration, its own entirely separate legal history. She inherited that farm. She did not inherit this parcel." She placed the deed on Prentice's bench. Briggs rose immediately. The deed's authenticity was in question. He argued, his voice carrying the measured confidence of a man making a prepared point. The signature required independent verification. The county's notarial records for 1881 should be consulted before the document was accepted as establishing the property right claimed. Prentice looked at Briggs over his reading glasses. "You're challenging the authenticity of a document bearing the county notary's seal. I'm requesting verification." "On what specific grounds?" Briggs's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Due diligence." Prentice looked at the deed for a moment. Then he looked at the gallery. "Mr. Egan, I understand you have something relevant to offer." Coot rose from his chair with the deliberateness of a man making each movement count. He walked to the front of the room. He stood with his hands at his sides, his walking stick leaning against the gallery bench behind him, and he told Prentice what he had told Wren in November. He had been in the county clerk's office on March 4th, 1881, filing paperwork on a mining claim dispute. He had been present when Neil Calloway completed the formal transfer of the Ute Creek deed into his daughter's name on the occasion of her 21st birthday. He had seen the notary stamp it. He could describe the document, the clerk, the office, the particular afternoon in detail, that matched precisely what was in front of the judge. Briggs cross-examined him for 10 minutes. The 10 minutes produced nothing useful for Briggs' case. Coote had been a working man in Colfax County for 30 years. He had no financial interest in the outcome of this hearing. His memory of the specific day was precise in the way that memory sometimes preserves certain moments with photographic fidelity for reasons that are not always apparent until later. Prentice called a recess of 30 minutes. He returned and delivered his ruling in 11 sentences. The deed was valid. The land had been purchased by Neil Calloway in 1860 and registered to his daughter upon her reaching lawful age in 1881, 3 years before the marriage to Mabel Durst, placing it entirely outside the scope of the inheritance claim. The petition of Mabel Durst Calloway was denied. The 40 acres in the Ute Creek Valley belonged to Wren May Calloway by legal right, as registered as witnessed, as determined by the plain reading of territorial property law. Mabel rose from her chair before Prentice had finished his final sentence. She walked out of the courtroom without speaking. The door closed behind her, and the room held the sound of it for a moment before settling back into the crackle of the wood stove. Briggs gathered his papers with the practiced neutrality of a man who has lost cases before and developed a professional method of packaging the experience. He had known. Wren had known he had known. The case had been a performance commissioned by a client who needed to feel she had done everything available to her, and Briggs had performed it competently, which was presumably what she had paid for. Wren picked up her deed from the bench. She thanked Prentice. She shook Coote's hand in the hallway outside. His grip was firm, the grip of a man who has spent a lifetime working with his hands. "Your father would have appreciated that," he said, his voice carrying the particular quality of understatement that belongs to people who have felt something deeply and chosen to say it plainly. He was thorough. So are you. Wren looked at her own hand, still holding the deed, the paper she had carried 11 miles through crusted snow before sunrise. "He gave me this the day I turned 21, she said. "He never told me it existed. He just trusted that I would find it and know what to do with it." Coote squeezed her hand once and released it. "Some people love you by telling you everything. Others love you by making sure you have what you need before you know you need it." He held her gaze. "Your father was the second kind." She didn't go back to the cave immediately. She went to Harker's store. What she learned from Harker in the ordinary course of buying flour and dried beans was the shape of what the winter had done to the county. He wasn't gossiping. He was a man who dealt in facts the way he dealt in goods, presenting them plainly for the buyer to assess. The South Range families had lost combined cattle herds totaling in the hundreds. 3 homesteads were being abandoned, families heading east or west toward relatives or lower elevations. The bank had sent notices in February to 11 property holders regarding mortgage payments that had not arrived because the money that should have covered those payments had been spent on firewood at 3 times the October price. The bank's standard practice was to issue notice in February and begin formal proceedings in April if payment was not received, which meant several of those 11 notices were now moving toward the next stage. Mabel Calloway's name was on one of those notices. Wren received this information without the expression she might have worn in October. She thought about Mabel sitting in a farmhouse through January and February burning wood at a rate that consumed her remaining capital, paying Briggs to file a legal motion on the theory that Wren's 40 acres would solve the shortfall, watching that motion fail. She thought about the particular quality of that position, a woman who had calculated everything correctly, except the variable she couldn't see, who had understood the farm's assets, but not its liabilities, who had spent a winter discovering that comfort costs what it costs, until suddenly it costs everything you have. She did not feel triumph. What she felt was something quieter, the specific feeling of watching a consequence arrive that you did not create, but that you saw coming and had no power to prevent. Mabel had made her choices. The winter had made Mabel answer for them. Wren had not designed that outcome. She had only survived long enough to be present when it arrived. She walked back to the cave. The sun was past its peak, and the light on the snow had the particular golden quality of early March, in the high country still cold, but different in character from the flat gray light of January, carrying in it the first suggestion of a season that had not entirely given up on becoming spring. The trail was familiar to her feet by now, each stone and rise and drainage crossing, known in the way that only months of daily use produces the trail knowledge having moved into the body below the level of thought. She went inside through the entrance into the chamber. The pool moved, the steam rose, The temperature had not changed. She stood at the edge of the pool with the deed in her hand and looked at the chamber that had kept her alive through the worst winter in territorial memory without asking anything from her except her presence. She thought about what it would mean to leave it. She thought about the 40 acres in the Ute Creek Valley, 9 miles south valley ground, good for building on and farming in a way this hillside cave could never be. She thought about what a life looked like when it moved from survival to construction, from holding on to building forward. She put the deed in the wooden box. She put the box back in the alcove. She stayed in the cave through March while the snow retreated from the lower elevations. She came out in early April into a world that was unrecognizable from October, not because the landscape had changed, but because the proportion of loss was visible everywhere. The brown meadows where cattle had stood, the fence lines that had come down under snow load and not been repaired because the people who would have repaired them were managing larger problems. The faces of people in Cimarron that carried the particular expression of those who have come through something and are not yet sure what they came through too. Dolph Crane found her outside the store on the first warm afternoon she spent in town, the kind of afternoon that arrives in early April in New Mexico territory and makes the preceding winter feel like a story about other people. He had something in his expression that she had not seen there in October or December. Not quite respect. Something more personal than that, the expression of a man revising an assumption he had held without examining it. "Your stepmother is gone," he said. "Packed up 2 weeks ago. Headed back to Missouri, I heard. The bank completed the foreclosure on the farm in late March." He paused. "The auction is next week. The Beal family from over near Springer is expected to bid." He looked at her with the evaluative attention of someone calculating a question. "You're looking well, better than anyone who spent a winter in those hills has any right to look." The shelter was good. Must have been something. It was exactly what it needed to be. He stood there for another moment, seeming to decide whether to say something else, then nodded once and went about his business. Wren stood on the warm sidewalk in the April sun and breathed the air that had lost its killing edge and smelled now of mud and pine and the particular freshness of snowmelt running in the draws below town. She did not go to the farm auction. The farm was the past. It was the life she had lost when the will was read in the front room in October, and she had spent 5 months learning that the life built from what remained was the more interesting one. Mabel could have the past. The bank could sell it. The Beal family could work it. Whatever it became, it would become without Wren Calloway's involvement because she had somewhere else to be. She went to the Ute Creek Valley. She had not seen the land since before her father died. She had known it existed, had known the approximate location from childhood references he had made, without explaining their full significance, had oriented herself toward it in a general way, across the winter without making it a destination until she could make it a real one. Now she walked 9 miles south from the cave on a morning in the second week of April, and she arrived at the eastern boundary of her 40 acres as the sun was reaching its midday height. The valley was narrow here, the creek running clear with snowmelt along the western edge, willows coming into their first tentative green along the banks. The valley floor was flat for perhaps a quarter mile before the ground began to rise toward the western ridge. The soil near the creek was dark, the kind of alluvial deposit that accumulates over centuries of spring flooding and represents in agricultural terms the difference between adequate and genuinely productive. The eastern slope caught morning sun and released it slowly through the afternoon. The site for a structure would be on the slight rise near the center of the parcel, elevated enough to be above the highest flood line, but close enough to the creek to make water management practical. She walked the perimeter of her 40 acres. She set a small cairn at each corner, stacking flat stones in a pile low enough not to be mistaken for a natural feature, but tall enough to be visible from 20 feet. She noted the drainage patterns, the vegetation, the aspect of each slope. She did what her father had taught her to do. She read the land before she asked anything of it. She was reading the eastern slope when she heard footsteps. The man who came around the willow screen along the creek bank was perhaps 30 years old, tall, moving through the terrain with the ease of someone comfortable in rough country. He carried a surveying rod over one shoulder and a transit case in his other hand. He stopped when he saw her at approximately the same moment she calculated she had placed herself directly on the corner cairn she had just stacked, which meant she was standing exactly on the boundary of her property. He looked at the cairn. He looked at her. "You're surveying this parcel." His voice was straightforward, neither suspicious nor apologetic, the voice of a man who asks what he needs to know. "I own this parcel," Wren said. "I'm placing my corners." He set down the transit case and looked at the cairn with professional attention. "Fletcher Aldridge. I was contracted by the county to verify the boundary of the parcels involved in the Callaway estate matter after the hearing resolved. The petition was denied last month." "I know, I was there." He looked at her then with a different quality of attention. "You're Wren Callaway." "I am." He stood for a moment in the particular way of someone revising what they thought they were walking into. "I was also contracted to do the general survey of this valley section last fall, October and November." He paused. "I was the one who found your cave entrance." She went still. "I was surveying the hillside for the county plat update," he said. "I saw the cedar screen. I moved a branch aside and felt the warm air coming out." He held her gaze without apology. "I put the branch back. I didn't go in. I didn't report it to anyone." He paused again. "I came back in February to confirm I hadn't imagined it." The warm air was still there. The entrance was sealed from the inside. He picked up his transit case. "I figured whoever was living in there had chosen not to be found, and that was a reasonable choice to respect." Wren looked at him for a long moment. She was reading him the way she read terrain, looking at what was present rather than what was claimed. The footprints in the snow outside the cave in February had been made by a man whose gait on the slope suggested someone trained primarily for measured level ground. A county surveyor working a hillside plat update would have exactly that stride pattern on unfamiliar terrain. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked. He looked at the creek for a moment before answering. "Because it wasn't my information to share." He said it simply without decoration. "Someone found shelter in a hard winter. That's between them and whatever gave them the shelter." He picked up his surveying rod. "I'll finish the boundary verification and get out of your way." He stayed for 3 hours. He worked methodically, checking the existing boundary markers against the deed description with the thoroughness of someone who takes the accuracy of his work as a personal matter rather than a professional obligation. When he found a discrepancy of 12 feet on the northern boundary line, he told her about it before he corrected it, explaining what the original survey had recorded and what the physical terrain actually showed. He treated her as someone capable of understanding the technical details of the problem, which she was. They worked in proximity through the afternoon, him verifying corners, her beginning to clear a section of ground near the central rise where she had decided the structure would go. They didn't talk much. What conversation there was moved along practical lines: the drainage characteristics of the valley floor, the timber available on the eastern slope, the question of whether the creek ran dependably through August or went seasonal in late summer. He knew the answer to the last question: it ran year-round, fed by a spring higher on the western ridge that the county survey had documented in 1879. When he left, he shook her hand at the eastern boundary cairn. His grip was direct, no performance in it. "Good luck with the build," he said. "You've got good land here." She looked at him. "You kept a confidence you had no obligation to keep." He shrugged slightly. "People who need to keep secrets usually have a reason. The reason doesn't have to be my business." He walked back toward the trail. She watched him go and thought about the difference between a man who looks at someone else's shelter and sees an opportunity and a man who looks at it and replaces the branch. Fletcher Aldridge came back to the Ute Creek Valley in May, not on county business. He came on a Tuesday morning with a lunch pail and the offer of an extra set of hands on the foundation work she was doing. She hadn't asked him. He had simply shown up and assessed what needed doing and started doing it. She had learned enough about people across the winter to understand the difference between assistance offered from a position of condescension and assistance offered from the position of someone who has skills you could use and would like to use them. She let him help. They worked through May. Through June, they continued to meet at the valley, the work expanding from foundation to frame. He was building something of his own in those months, a professional case for continued county work in the northern section of the territory, which required him to be in the area regardless. She understood this. She also understood that the valley was not on his direct route to any of his contracted survey sites. The geothermal system came from a conversation they had at the edge of the creek one afternoon in late June, when she described aloud what had kept her alive through the winter, and he had taken out his notebook without saying anything and they had spent the rest of that afternoon working through the engineering of it together. The idea was hers. The calculations were joint. The system they designed was simple in the way that solutions are simple after someone has understood the problem clearly. The hot spring 40 feet above the valley floor on the hillside to the east ran water at consistent temperature year-round. A pipe system, copper where it mattered, and clay tile where copper was too expensive, could bring that water under the cabin floor through channels cut into the foundation, stones radiating heat upward through the floor into the living space, the way the cave floor had radiated heat upward through the stone. The spent water would exit through a drainage channel into the creek below the spring source. The system required no fuel, no maintenance beyond occasional inspection, no management except the intelligence that had designed it. They built the cabin in the summer of 1887, working steadily through the heat of July into the relative cool of August. Fletcher came every week, sometimes more often. The conversations that happened alongside the physical work covered ground that work conversations cover when the people having them are interested in each other, which they were, which became increasingly impossible to ignore as the walls went up and the roof went on and the pipe system went in beneath the floor. He asked her to marry him in September of 1887. Sitting on the finished front step of the cabin with the Ute Creek Valley spread out below them in the last warm light of the season. He asked her in the straightforward way he did most things, without elaborate preparation, stating what he felt and what he was asking, and leaving the decision entirely to her. She thought about it for 3 days before she answered him, not because she was uncertain, but because she had learned over the past year to give important decisions the time they deserved. She said yes on a Thursday morning, standing at the eastern boundary cairn of her 40 acres, with the creek running clear below them. They married in April of 1888 in the Cimarron Courthouse with Coot Egan as witness and Harker from the general store as the second, which was the precise number of witnesses the ceremony required. The judge who performed it was not Prentice, who had retired, but a younger man named Coulter, who did the work with appropriate brevity. Afterward, they walked back to the Ute Creek Valley and ate a meal Wren had prepared from the garden she had put in the previous spring. The cabin had been warm through its first winter without a single cord of wood. The geothermal floor system had performed exactly as designed, the temperature inside holding steady through December and January and February, while the range behind them held the year's new snow. No fuel cost, no morning ritual of coaxing a cold stove into function, no anxiety about what happened when the woodpile ran out. The heat came from the earth the way all warmth ultimately comes from the earth, not borrowed from the surface, but drawn from the deep original source that no winter could reach. She still had the cave. She went back sometimes alone in the late autumn, before the first snow, when the hillside was stripped of its summer green and the limestone showed pale against the dark juniper. She would sit at the edge of the pool for an hour, sometimes two, and let the warmth work into her the way it had worked into her on the first night in October of 1886, when she had spread her grandmother's quilt on the warm stone and let the cold leave her bones one layer at a time. Coot Egan died in the spring of 1889. He had been declining through the winter, his knees finally refusing the compromise they had maintained for a decade, his chest developing the cough that came and did not leave. He was in a room at Mrs. Holt's boarding house, the same boarding house where a night had cost 50 cents in the winter. Wren couldn't afford it. Mrs. Holt had given him the corner room with the south-facing window, and in the final weeks she charged him half rate without explaining why, which was a kindness he acknowledged by not mentioning it. Wren was there through the final weeks. She had come every third day through March, walking the 12 miles from the Ute Creek Valley and returning the same day, bringing food she had prepared, and hot tea in a sealed tin, and whatever news from the valley she thought he would want to hear. She told him about the garden expansion, the second pipe run she was planning, the pair of horses Fletcher had acquired in February. He listened with the concentrated attention of someone who has made peace with where he is and finds genuine interest in where others are going. On the last morning, she sat beside his bed and held his hand, and they were both quiet for a long time. His breathing had the quality she recognized from her father's final days, the particular irregularity that preceded the final settling. "Someone showed me that cave when I was young," he said. His voice was thin but completely clear, the voice of a man who has decided which words to spend his remaining breath on. "Fellow named Carver. He'd found it from a Ute trapper who'd used it for decades before either of them. I showed it to you." You'll show it to somebody. He rested for a moment. That's how these things work. Not property, just passing. He looked at the south window, where the spring light came in pale but present. Was it enough, he asked, not asking about the cave specifically, asking about something larger than the cave, the whole chain of it, the series of hands it had passed through, the question of whether a life built from small acts of trust and generosity between strangers accumulates into something that justifies itself. Wren held his hand. It was more than enough, she said. It was everything. He died 3 hours later in the early afternoon with the spring light still in the window. Wren stayed until it was done. She sat with him in the quiet of the room and thought about the word passing and what it contained. The idea that certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of care were not possessions but movements, things that existed in the giving rather than the holding that diminished when stored and multiplied when released. She walked back to the Ute Creek Valley in the afternoon. Fletcher was working the near field when she came over the ridge, and he looked up and saw her face and set down his implement and came to meet her. She walked into him and he put his arms around her, and they stood at the edge of the field in the spring afternoon, and she let herself be held. She cried then. Not for long. She had learned that grief is not a debt you owe the dead, but a measure of what they gave you, and the measure in this case was considerable. In the years that followed, she showed the cave to two people. The first was Fletcher in the autumn of 1889, who went inside and stood at the edge of the pool and was quiet for several minutes before he spoke. He found this at 25 and kept it secret for 30 years, and then gave it to you. His voice carried a quality she recognized as the response to something that exceeds ordinary categories. That's a very long patience. He had reasons, she said. So did my father. Fletcher looked at her. You come from people who think in decades. She considered that for a moment. I try to, she said. The second person she showed the cave to was a girl of 16 named Ruthie Coulter, the judge's youngest daughter who came to the Callaway Aldrich property in the summer of 1893 as a hired helper for the harvest season, and who arrived with the specific quality of someone carrying a weight too large for the container she was in. Wren recognized it the way you recognize things you have been. One afternoon, she took Ruthie up the hillside and showed her the cedar screen and the entrance and the pool, and she sat beside the pool with her while the warmth came up from the water, and she watched the weight in the girl's face shift slightly, not dissolve, not disappear, but become less total, less like the only thing in the world. What is this place? Ruthie asked. It's warm, Wren said. That's all it needs to be right now. They sat together in the warmth of the earth for a long time, without speaking, two women at different distances from the same kind of trouble. And the pool moved beside them the way it had always moved, the way it would move long after they had both gone from this hillside. In 1923, a marker was placed near the cave entrance by the County Historical Society. It described the geothermal features of the eastern Cimarron Range. It noted that early settlers had occasionally used hot springs for warmth. It mentioned no names. But on the wall of the cave near the pool in the place where Coot Egan had scratched his initials and his date and his 3 words, there was now another line added below his. It had been put there with the same hand auger Wren had used to dig herself out of the January storm. Its tip dragged slowly through the limestone to make letters that would hold their shape in the rock for as long as the rock held its shape. The line read WCA 1886. The earth does not forget what it has sheltered. The pool moved, the steam rose, the heat came up from below as it had come up for 10,000 years, patient as stone, constant as the pressure that drives warm water toward the surface of a world that has no idea what it's being given. Some things are passed on. Some things simply continue. The spring keeps flowing.